questioned the child carefully. She said there was another man, a stranger, in the station with Larry when she went in, and that though she didn't hear anything they said, and Larry was sitting with his chair tilted back and his feet on the stove, she somehow had thought they were quarreling. The stranger, she said, was standing. He had a fur coat on, and his eyes snapped like he was mad, and she was very afraid of him. I asked her if she could recall anything else about him, and she said, yes, he had very red lips. When I heard that, my heart grew cold as a snow lump, and when I went out the wind seemed to go clear through me. It was evident enough that Fraymark had gone down there to make trouble, had quarrelled with Larry, and had boarded either the 5:30 passenger or the extra, and got the conductor to let him off at his ranch, and accounted for his late appearance at the dance. It was 5 o'clock then, but the 5:30 train was 2 hours late, so there was nothing to do but sit down and wait for the conductor, who had gone out on the 7 o'clock eastbound the night before, and who must have seen Larry when he picked up the car of wool. It was growing dark by that time. The sky was a dull lead color, and the snow had drifted about the little town until it was almost buried, and was still coming down so fast that you could scarcely see your hand before you. I was never so glad to hear anything as that whistle, when old 153 came lumbering and groaning in through the snow. I ran out on the platform to meet her, and her headlight looked like the face of an old friend. I caught the conductor's arm the minute he stepped off the train, but he wouldn't talk until he got in by the fire. He said he hadn't seen O'Toole at all the night before, but he had found the bill for the wool car on the table, with a note from Larry asking him to take the ear out on the Q.T., and he had concluded that Larry had gone up to Cheyenne on the 5:30. I wired the Cheyenne office and managed to catch the express clerk who had gone through on the extra the night before. He wired me, saying that he had not seen Larry board the extra, but that his dog had crept into his usual place in the express car, and he had supposed Larry was in the coach. He had seen Fraymark get on at Grover, and the train had slowed up a trifle at his ranch to let him off, for Fraymark stood in with some of the boys, and sent his cattle shipments our way. When the night fairly closed down on me, I began to wonder how a gay, expansive fellow like O'Toole had ever stood 6 months at Grover. The snow had let up by that time, and the stars were beginning to glitter cold and bright through the hurrying clouds. I put on my ulster and went outside. I began a minute tour of inspection. I went through empty freight cars run down by the siding, searched the coal houses and primitive cellar, examining them carefully, and calling O'Toole's name. Duke at my heels dragged himself painfully about, but seemed as much at sea as I, and betrayed the nervous suspense and alertness of a bird dog that has lost its game. I went back to the office, and took the big station lamp upstairs to make a more careful examination of Larry's sleeping room. The suit of clothes that he usually wore at his back was hanging on the wall. His shaving things were lying about, and I recognized the silver-backed military hair-brushes that Miss Masterson had given him at Christmas time, lying on his chiffonier. The upper drawer was open, and a pair of white kid gloves was lying on the corner. A white string tie hung across his pipe-rack. It was crumpled, and had evidently proved unsatisfactory when he tied it. On the chiffonier lay several clean handkerchiefs with holes in them, where he had unfolded them and thrown them by in a hasty search for a whole one. A black silk muffler hung on the chair-back, and a top hat was set awry on the head of a plaster cast of Parnell, Larry's hero. His dress suit was missing, so there was no doubt that he had dressed for the party. His overcoat lay on his trunk, and his dancing shoes were on the floor, at the foot of the bed beside his everyday ones. I knew that his pumps were a little tight. He had joked about them when I was down the Sunday before the dance, but he had only one pair, and he couldn't have got another in Grover if he had tried himself. That set me to thinking. He was a dainty fellow about his shoes, and I knew his collection pretty well. I went to his closet and found them all there. Even granting him a prejudice against overcoats, I couldn't conceive of him going out in that stinging weather without shoes. I noticed that a surgeon's case, such as are carried on passengers' trains, and which Larry had once appropriated in Cheyenne, was open, and that the roll of medicated cotton had been pulled out and recently used. Each discovery I made served only to add to my perplexity. Granted that Fraymark had been there, and granted that he had played the boy an ugly trick, he could not have spirited him away without the knowledge of the train crew. "Duke, old doggie," I said to the poor spaniel, who was sniffing and whining about the bed, "you haven't done your duty. You must have seen what went on between your master and that clam-blooded Asiatic, and you ought to be able to give me a tip of some sort." I decided to go to bed and make a fresh start on the ugly business in the morning. The bed looked as though someone had been lying on it, so I started to beat it up a little before I got in. I took off the pillow, and as I pulled up the mattress, on the edge of the ticking at the head of the bed I saw a dark red stain about the size of my hand. I felt the cold sweat come out on me, and my hands were dangerously unsteady, as I carried the lamp over and set it down on the chair by the bed. But Duke was too quick for me. He had seen that stain, and leaping on the bed began sniffing it, and whining like a dog that is being whipped to death. I bent down and felt it with my fingers. It was dry, but the colour and stiffness were unmistakably those of coagulated blood. I caught up my coat and vest and ran downstairs with Duke yelping at my heels. My first impulse was to go and call some one, but from the platform not a single light was visible, and I knew the section men had been in bed for hours. I remembered then that Larry was often annoyed by hemorrhages of the nose in that high altitude, but even that did not altogether quiet my nerves, and I realized that sleeping in that bed was quite out of the question. Larry always kept a supply of brandy and soda on hand, so I made myself a stiff drink, and filled the stove and locked the door, turned down the lamp, and lay down on the operator's table. I had often slept there when I was a night operator. At first it was impossible to sleep, for Duke kept starting up and limping to the door and scratching at it, yelping nervously. He kept this up until I was thoroughly unstrung, and though I'm ordinarily cool enough, there wasn't money enough in Wyoming to have bribed me to open that door. I felt cold all over every time I went near it, and I even drew the big rusty bolt that was never used, and it seemed to me that it groaned heavily as I drew it, or perhaps it was the wind outside that groaned. As for Duke, I threatened to put him out, and boxed his ears until I hurt his feelings, and he lay down in front of the door with his muzzle between his paws and his eyes shining like live coals, and riveted on the crack under the door. The situation was gruesome enough, but the liquor had made me drowsy, and at last I fell asleep. It must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning that I was awakened by the crying of the dog, a whimper low, continuous, and pitiful, and indescribably human. While I was blinking my eyes in an effort to get thoroughly awake, I heard another sound, the grating sound of chalk on a wooden chalkboard, or of a soft pencil on a slate. I turned my head to the right, and saw a man standing with his back to me, chalking something on the bulletin board. At a glance I recognized the broad, high shoulders and the handsome head of my friend. Yet there was that about the figure which kept me from calling his name, or from moving a muscle where I lay. He finished his writing and dropped the chalk, and I distinctly heard its click as it fell. He made a gesture as though he were dusting his fingers, and then turned facing me, holding his left hand in front of his mouth. I saw him clearly in the soft light of the station lamp. He wore his dress clothes, and began moving towards the door silently as a shadow in his black stocking feet. There was about his movements an indescribable stiffness, as though his limbs had been frozen. His face was chalky white, his hair seemed damp, and was plastered down close about his temples. His eyes were colourless jellies, dull as lead, and staring straight before him. When he reached the door, he lowered the hand he held before his mouth to open the latch. His face was turned squarely towards me, and the lower jaw had fallen, and was set rigidly upon his collar. The mouth was wide open, and was stuffed full of white cotton. Then I knew it was a dead man's face I looked upon. The door opened, and that stiff black figure in stockings walked as noiselessly as a cat out into the night. I think I went quite mad then. I dimly remember that I rushed out upon the siding and ran up and down screaming, "Larry! Larry!" until the wind seemed to echo my call. The stars were out in myriads, and the snow glistened in their light, but I could see nothing but the wide, white plain, not even a dark shadow anywhere. When at last I found myself back in the station, I saw Duke lying before the door, and dropped on my knees beside him, calling him by name. But Duke was past calling back. Master and dog had gone together, and I dragged him into the corner and covered his face, for his eyes were colourless and soft, like the eyes of that horrible face once so beloved. The blackboard? Oh, I didn't forget that. I had chalked the time of the accommodation on it the night before, from sheer force of habit, for it isn't customary to mark the time of trains in unimportant stations like Grover. My writing had been rubbed out by a moist hand, for I could see the finger marks clearly, and in place of it was written in blue chalk simply, C, B, and Q, 26387. I sat there drinking brandy and muttering to myself before that blackboard until those blue letters danced up and down like magic lantern pictures when you jiggle the slides. I drank until the sweat poured off me like rain, and my teeth chattered, and I turned sick at the stomach. At last an idea flashed over me.